Normal air, 21% oxygen. You start feeling dizzy at 17%. You lose consciousness at 14%. You die at 10%. Michael Torres and his team were exploring an unmapped cave when their oxygen meter started dropping. 18%, 16%, 14%, and they had no idea which direction led to fresh air. Welcome to Cave Stories, where we examine real cave accidents and the critical mistakes that turned adventure into a race against invisible death. Michael Torres was a professional cave researcher, not a reckless thrill seeker. The 35-year-old biologist specialized in studying cave ecosystems, documenting species that lived in complete darkness, understanding the delicate balance of underground environments. Over 12 years, he'd explored and mapped dozens of cave systems, always with proper equipment, always with experienced teams, always following safety protocols. His research had been published in scientific journals. Universities invited him to speak. He was respected in the caving community as someone who combined adventure with rigorous scientific methodology. But on November 3, 2020, Michael's expertise and experience weren't enough to protect him from one of caving's most insidious dangers: bad air. Black Hollow Cave System in eastern Kentucky had been discovered only 3 months earlier by a local landowner who noticed cold air flowing from a crack in his property during summer. He'd reported it to the Kentucky Speleological Survey, and they'd done a preliminary assessment. The entrance led to what appeared to be an extensive, unmapped system, possibly several miles of passages. This was exciting news for cave researchers. Most accessible caves in Kentucky had already been thoroughly explored and mapped. Finding a completely unknown system was rare and valuable for scientific research. Michael had been waiting for an opportunity like this. He assembled a team of 3 other experienced cavers for an exploration and mapping expedition. Dr. James Chen was a geologist who specialized in cave formation and mineralogy. Lauren Matthews was a professional cave photographer whose images had appeared in National Geographic. Ryan Cooper was an equipment specialist who ensured they had the latest safety technology. All 4 of them had extensive experience in cave exploration. This was a professional scientific expedition, not a casual adventure. They were prepared, equipped, and qualified. But they made one critical oversight that would nearly kill them all. The oversight was this: they didn't adequately research the cave's ventilation characteristics before entering. Cave ventilation is complex. Some caves breathe with air flowing in and out due to barometric pressure changes or temperature differentials. These caves have good air exchange with the surface. Other caves are dead, with little or no airflow, allowing carbon dioxide to accumulate and oxygen levels to drop. Black Hollow Cave, they would discover too late, was a dead cave, and they'd walked into it without proper preparation for that possibility. This was mistake number 1. On November 2nd, the day before the expedition, Michael's team met at his house to review their plan and check equipment. They would enter Black Hollow Cave at 9 a.m., explore and map for approximately 4 to 5 hours, then exit by mid-afternoon. They'd bring extensive equipment: helmets with LED headlamps, backup lights, rope and climbing gear, first aid supplies, food and water, communication radios, and most importantly, an electronic oxygen meter. The oxygen meter was a handheld device that measured the percentage of oxygen in the air. Normal atmospheric oxygen is 21%. The meter would alarm if oxygen dropped below 19.5%, the OSHA minimum for safe breathing. But here's what they didn't bring: supplemental oxygen tanks or rebreathers for all team members. They had 2 small emergency rebreathers, compact devices that recycled exhaled air and scrubbed out CO2. But these were intended for emergencies only and had limited capacity, maybe 45 minutes each. The thinking was that if the oxygen meter showed levels dropping, they'd simply retreat to the entrance where fresh air was guaranteed. This seemed logical and was standard practice for most cave exploration. but it assumed they could navigate back to the entrance quickly and efficiently. In an unmapped cave where passages branched and doubled back unpredictably, that assumption would prove dangerous. This inadequate breathing redundancy was mistake number 2. The morning of November 3rd was cool and clear, perfect for caving. The team loaded their gear into Michael's truck and drove 2 hours to the property owner's land. The entrance to Black Hollow Cave was unimpressive. A narrow crack in a limestone hillside, surrounded by fall leaves and brush. But when Michael held his hand near the opening, he felt air movement. Cold air was flowing out of the cave, which he interpreted as a good sign. Airflow meant ventilation, which meant fresh air exchange. What he didn't realize was that the airflow was minimal and only occurred at the entrance. Deep in the cave system, there was no circulation at all. This misinterpretation of the airflow was mistake number 3. They entered Black Hollow Cave at 9:15 a.m. The entrance passage was a tight squeeze, requiring them to crawl on hands and knees for about 20 feet before it opened into a larger corridor. Michael led, followed by James, then Lauren, with Ryan bringing up the rear. Ryan carried the oxygen meter, checking it periodically. At the entrance, it read 20.8%, perfectly normal. The passage widened to about 6 feet in diameter, comfortable walking height. The walls were covered in flowstone formations, and small stalactites hung from the ceiling. It was a beautiful cave, pristine and untouched by previous explorers. For the first hour, exploration went perfectly. They moved slowly through the passages, with Michael and James taking measurements and notes, Lauren photographing formations, and Ryan managing their supplies and tracking their route on hand-drawn maps. The cave system was complex, with passages branching in multiple directions, but they carefully marked each junction with reflective tape and numbered markers. Standard procedure: mark your route so you can retrace it. The oxygen meter, checked every 15 minutes, consistently showed readings between 20.5% and 21%. Everything was normal. At 10:30 a.m., they reached a junction where 5 passages converged. This was interesting from a geological standpoint. Such junctions often indicated significant water flow in the cave's formation history. They decided to explore the eastern passage, which sloped gradually downward. Michael placed a large marker at the junction. Junction Alpha, 10:30 a.m., took East Passage. This would help them navigate back. They proceeded down the eastern passage, which narrowed and twisted but remained passable. The walls here were different, darker limestone with interesting mineral deposits that James wanted to document. At 11 a.m., Ryan checked the oxygen meter as part of his regular routine. The reading was 20.2%, still within normal range, but slightly lower than before. He mentioned it to Michael. Oxygen's dropped a bit. Still fine, but worth noting. Michael nodded. Caves often have slight variations in oxygen levels depending on depth and airflow patterns. A drop from 21% to 20.2% wasn't concerning. It was within the range of normal variation. They continued exploring. The eastern passage led them deeper into the cave, descending gradually. After 20 minutes, they reached a large chamber, perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet high. The chamber was stunning, with massive columns connecting floor to ceiling and a small pool of crystal-clear water in the center. Lauren immediately started photographing, her flash creating dramatic shadows on the cave walls. This chamber would be a highlight of their exploration. James examined the water chemistry while Michael documented the chamber's dimensions. They spent 15 minutes in the chamber, absorbed in their work. At 11:35 a.m., Ryan checked the oxygen meter again. 19.8%. Another drop, but still not alarming. He reported it to Michael. "We're at 19.8% now." Michael frowned slightly. "That's getting lower. Let's check it in 10 minutes. If it drops more, we'll head back." This was sensible decision-making. They weren't in immediate danger at 19.8%, but the trend was worth monitoring. Ryan set a timer on his watch for 10 minutes. They explored 3 passages leading out of the chamber. One was too tight to navigate. The second appeared to dead end after 50 feet. The third, a passage heading roughly north, seemed promising. It was wide and showed signs of historical water flow. Michael made the decision to explore this northern passage. Before leaving the chamber, he placed another marker. Chamber A, 11:40 a.m., taking North Passage. They moved forward, unaware that they were making a critical error. The northern passage was leading them away from the main cave system into a poorly ventilated section where air exchange was minimal, but they had no way to know this. The passage looked like any other. At 11:45 a.m., Ryan's timer went off. He checked the oxygen meter. 19.3%. His stomach tightened. That's a bigger drop. We're down to 19.3%. Michael stopped walking and turned around. Show me. Ryan held up the meter. The digital display clearly showed 19.3%, and the device was showing a yellow caution indicator, though not yet the red alarm that would trigger at 19.5% oxygen as a safety threshold per OSHA standards. Michael made a quick assessment. We're below 19.5%. That's our safety threshold. We need to head back to the entrance. James agreed immediately. Lauren looked disappointed. There was so much more to photograph, but she understood. Safety protocols existed for a reason. They began retracing their steps, following their marked route back toward Chamber A. But here's where things started to go wrong. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, doesn't just affect your body. It affects your brain, your judgment, your ability to navigate. At 19% oxygen, you might not notice any symptoms yet. But your cognitive function is already slightly impaired. Your reaction time slowed, your decision-making subtly degraded. The 4 of them didn't feel any different as they walked back through the northern passage. But their brains were already beginning to be affected, and this would lead to mistakes. They reached Chamber A and immediately looked for their exit marker. Michael shone his light around the chamber. Where's the marker? I put it right at the entrance to the passage we came in from. They searched. The chamber had 5 passages leading away from it. They'd entered from 1, explored 3, and needed to retrace their steps through the entrance passage. But which one was it? The markers should have made it obvious, but Michael couldn't find the marker he'd placed. It's possible they were disoriented, viewing the chamber from a different angle than when they'd entered. It's possible the marker had fallen or been accidentally kicked aside. Or it's possible their hypoxia-affected brains simply couldn't process visual information as efficiently as normal. Whatever the reason, they couldn't immediately identify their entrance passage. Ryan suggested 1 passage. James thought it was a different one. Michael wasn't sure. This confusion, this inability to quickly identify the correct route, was the first sign of cognitive impairment from low oxygen. They didn't recognize it as such. They thought they were just being careful. After 2 minutes of discussion and checking their maps, they chose a passage that seemed right. It matched their descriptions from earlier. They entered it, walking quickly now, eager to reach higher oxygen levels. Ryan checked the meter. 19.0%. The yellow caution light was glowing steadily. They needed to get back to the entrance soon. But after 5 minutes in the passage, something felt wrong. Michael didn't remember the passage being this long, and the formations didn't look familiar. He stopped the group. I don't think this is right. We should have reached Junction Alpha by now. They consulted their rough maps, trying to orient themselves. But maps drawn quickly during exploration are imperfect, especially when you're trying to read them while breathing low oxygen air that's making your brain sluggish. James made a suggestion. Let's go back to Chamber A and try a different passage. They turned around and retraced their steps. Back in the chamber, Ryan checked the oxygen meter again. 18.7%. The drop was accelerating. Why? They didn't know. Perhaps the passages they were exploring had even worse ventilation than the ones they'd been in earlier. Perhaps their own breathing was depleting the oxygen in the stagnant air. Whatever the reason, they were now in a dangerous situation. Oxygen levels below 19% cause measurable cognitive impairment. Below 17%, you start feeling dizzy and experiencing confusion. They were approaching that threshold. Michael felt the first symptoms around noon, though he didn't immediately recognize them. A slight headache, a feeling of being slightly disconnected, as if watching events from a distance. His breathing had unconsciously increased, his body trying to compensate for the lower oxygen by taking in more air. But when the air itself is oxygen poor, breathing faster doesn't help much. It just makes you feel more breathless. They chose another passage from Chamber A, this time with more careful deliberation. They walked for 10 minutes and reached a junction that looked familiar. "Junction Alpha!" Lauren exclaimed with relief. "We're back on track." But when they examined it more carefully, they realized it wasn't Junction Alpha. It was similar, with multiple passages converging, but the markers were wrong. This was a different junction. How had they gotten here? Their maps didn't show this junction at all. They were lost, not just confused, but genuinely lost in an unmapped cave system with dropping oxygen levels. Ryan checked the meter at 12:15 p.m. 18.2%. His hands were shaking as he showed the others. "We're at 18.2%. That's getting really low. We need to find the exit right now." But which direction was the exit? They'd been walking for almost an hour since leaving Chamber A, trying different passages, and nothing looked familiar anymore. Their oxygen-deprived brains couldn't form clear spatial maps. The passages all looked similar. The junctions all looked the same. They were disoriented and confused, and the low oxygen was making it worse with every passing minute. Michael tried to think clearly, to use his training and experience to solve the problem. But thinking clearly was becoming difficult. His thoughts felt slow, sticky, hard to hold on to. "Okay," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. We need a systematic approach. We pick one direction and follow it consistently. Always take the left-hand passage at junctions. Eventually, we'll either find the exit or map out where we are." It was logical advice, the kind of thing taught in cave rescue courses. But implementing it required discipline and clear thinking, both of which were being eroded by hypoxia. They followed Michael's plan, taking left-hand passages at every junction. For 20 minutes, they moved through the cave system, marking their route with their remaining reflective tape. But the passages seemed endless, twisting and turning, sometimes narrowing to crawls, sometimes opening into small chambers, and the oxygen meter kept dropping. 18.0%, 17.8%, 17.5%. At 12:40 p.m., the meter read 17.2%, and the alarm finally activated, a shrill beeping that echoed through the limestone passages. Ryan silenced the alarm, but the damage to morale was done. The beeping had made the danger real and immediate. "We're in serious trouble," James said, his voice tight with fear. "At 17%, we're going to start losing coordination and judgment. We might not even realize we're making mistakes." Michael knew James was right. Hypoxia at this level caused symptoms similar to alcohol intoxication: impaired judgment, slowed reactions, confusion, euphoria in some cases. They could make catastrophic navigation errors and not even realize it until too late. Lauren suggested using the emergency rebreathers. "We have 2 of them. We can take turns using them to keep our oxygen levels up while we search for the exit." It was a reasonable suggestion, but Michael hesitated. The rebreathers had limited capacity, maybe 45 minutes each. If they used them now and still didn't find the exit, They'd have nothing left when oxygen levels dropped even lower, but if they didn't use them, their cognitive function would continue degrading, making it less likely they'd find the exit at all. It was a terrible choice with no good answer. Michael made a decision. James and I will use the rebreathers for 20 minutes each to keep our navigation skills sharp. Ryan and Lauren, you'll conserve air by moving slowly and breathing shallowly. We focus everything on finding a passage with airflow. Any passage where you feel air movement, even slight, that's the direction we go. They distributed the 2 rebreathers. James put one on immediately, and Michael took the other. The devices fit over the mouth and nose like a mask, with canisters that scrubbed CO2 from exhaled breath and added a small amount of supplemental oxygen. Within seconds of using the rebreather, James felt his head clear slightly. The improvement was noticeable and terrifying. It showed just how impaired he'd already become. They continued moving, but now they were actively testing for airflow. At each junction, they'd hold still and feel for any breeze, any movement of air against their skin. Caves with good ventilation have air currents, sometimes subtle but detectable. Dead caves have no air movement at all. Black Hollow Cave, in the deep sections where they were trapped, was completely still. No breeze, no circulation, just stagnant, oxygen-poor air that was slowly killing them. At 1 p.m., the oxygen meter read 16.8%. Michael and James had been using the rebreathers for 15 minutes. Ryan and Lauren were showing obvious signs of hypoxia. Lauren kept giggling inappropriately, a symptom of oxygen deprivation that causes euphoria in some people. Ryan was stumbling, his coordination degraded, his movements clumsy. His speech was slightly slurred when he said, "I don't feel good. Like I'm drunk. This is bad, isn't it?" "It's very bad," Michael confirmed. He checked his watch. They'd been underground for almost 4 hours, the last 2 hours lost in dealing with declining oxygen. At this rate, they had perhaps another hour before oxygen levels dropped to the point where unconsciousness became a real risk. 14% oxygen is the threshold where most people lose consciousness. Below that, brain damage and death follow quickly. They were now in a race against their own biology. Michael's rebreather hissed. The canister was exhausted. He removed it and immediately felt the difference. Within 30 seconds, his thoughts began to slow again, his head feeling fuzzy and disconnected. He handed the depleted rebreather to Ryan. "You and Lauren take turns with James's. Save it for when you absolutely need it." Ryan nodded, put on the rebreather James had been using, and took several deep breaths. His eyes cleared slightly, focus returning to his face. They pressed forward, taking another left-hand passage. This one sloped upward, which gave them a flicker of hope. Upward might mean closer to the surface, closer to fresh air. They climbed for 5 minutes, the passage becoming steeper. Michael's legs were burning from the exertion and his breathing was labored. When you're breathing low oxygen air, physical exertion becomes exponentially harder. Your muscles are starved for oxygen, producing lactic acid, cramping, and failing. He had to stop twice to rest, his hands on his knees, gasping for breath that didn't satisfy. At the top of the slope, the passage leveled out and opened into a small chamber. And there, in the far wall, was something that made Michael's oxygen-deprived brain flood with hope, a crack in the rock with a visible beam of light coming through. "Daylight!" Lauren gasped. "We found it!" They rushed forward, but as they got closer, their hope died. The crack was maybe 2 inches wide, far too small for a person to fit through. They could see daylight and trees beyond, tantalizingly close but utterly unreachable. They were perhaps only a few feet from the surface, but those few feet were solid limestone. The discovery was emotionally devastating. They'd been so close to escape, but the crack wasn't an exit. It was just a tease, a reminder of the world they might never see again if they didn't find the real entrance. Michael slumped against the wall, fighting despair. The oxygen meter in Ryan's hand beeped again. He looked at the display and his face went pale. 16.0%. We just dropped below 16%. His voice was shaking. 16% oxygen. At this level, every member of the team was experiencing significant impairment. Dizziness, headache, nausea, confusion, impaired judgment, and reduced coordination. They were all feeling it now, no longer able to deny or minimize the symptoms. Lauren sat down abruptly, her legs giving out. I need to rest. Just for a minute. Michael knew that resting was dangerous. When you stop moving, you stop searching for an exit. But he also knew they needed a moment to think, to plan, to use whatever cognitive function remained. James, still using the second rebreather, was the most lucid of the group. He studied their hand-drawn map, trying to make sense of their wandering route. We've been going in circles, he said. Look, we passed this junction twice, just from different directions. We're not systematically exploring. We're just wandering randomly because our brains aren't working right. He was right. The map showed a confusing tangle of lines doubling back on themselves, passages explored multiple times, junctions visited from different angles. They'd been lost in a maze of their own confusion. We need a different strategy, James continued. We've been trying to find the entrance by navigation. That's not working. Instead, we need to find fresh air by following the gradient. Air flows from high concentration to low concentration. Somewhere in this cave system, there's fresh 21% oxygen air coming from the entrance. We need to map the oxygen levels in different passages and move toward higher concentrations. It was brilliant reasoning, exactly the kind of scientific problem-solving they needed. But implementing it required moving through multiple passages, checking oxygen levels in each, remembering the readings, and making logical decisions based on the data. Could they do that with compromised brains? They tried. James gave the rebreather to Michael so he could lead with clearer thinking. They returned to the nearest junction and methodically checked oxygen levels in each of the 3 passages. East Passage, 16.1%. North Passage, 15.8%. West Passage, 16.3%. The differences were small but real. West had the highest oxygen, which meant it was likely closer to a source of fresh air. They took the West Passage, moving slowly, checking the oxygen meter every 2 minutes to ensure they were going the right direction. After 5 minutes in the West Passage, the meter read 16.5%. An increase! They were on the right track. Hope surged through the group. They continued, checking at each junction, always moving toward higher oxygen readings. 16.7%, 17.0%, 17.2%. They were climbing out of the hypoxic zone, literally following the oxygen gradient like bloodhounds tracking a scent. Michael's head was starting to clear, his thoughts becoming more linear and logical. They were going to make it. They were going to find the entrance. But then, disaster. At 1:35 p.m., Lauren collapsed. One moment she was walking, the next moment she was on the cave floor, unconscious. Michael rushed to her side, his heart pounding. Lauren! Lauren, can you hear me? No response. He checked her pulse, fast but present. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Ryan checked the oxygen meter in the passage where she'd collapsed, 15.2%. They'd somehow wandered into a low oxygen pocket, a dead-end passage with particularly poor air. And Lauren, who'd been without the rebreather for the longest time, had succumbed to acute hypoxia. Ryan immediately put the rebreather on Lauren's face. James tilted her head back to open her airway. Michael rubbed her sternum, a painful stimulus to try to rouse her. Lauren, wake up. Come on, wake up. After 30 seconds that felt like hours, Lauren's eyes fluttered open. She looked confused, disoriented, didn't seem to recognize where she was or who was around her. "Let her breathe from the rebreather for a few minutes," James instructed. "We need to get her oxygen levels up before we can move her." This collapse changed everything. They now had an unconscious or semi-conscious team member in a low-oxygen environment. Carrying her would be extremely difficult in the narrow passages, and her collapse demonstrated how close they all were to the same fate. At 15% oxygen, loss of consciousness happens quickly and without warning. They were all on the edge of collapse. Michael checked his watch, 1:40 p.m. They'd been underground for 4.5 hours. He had no idea how long they had before they all collapsed, but it couldn't be much longer. Michael made the hardest decision of his life. "James, you and I are going to carry Lauren. Ryan, you go ahead of us, fast as you can, following the oxygen gradient. When you find fresh air or the entrance, come back for us. We'll move as fast as we can, but you'll be faster alone." Ryan started to protest. You never split the team in an emergency, but Michael cut him off. "If we all stay together moving slow, we might all die. If you go fast, you can get help. It's our best chance. Go. Now." Ryan took the functioning rebreather, took one last look at his friends, and ran. He moved through the passages faster than safety normally allowed, trusting his oxygen-starved brain to navigate by instinct and gradient. Behind him, Michael and James picked up Lauren in a fireman's carry, with James taking her upper body and Michael her legs. She was semi-conscious, moaning but not responsive to questions. They started moving, much slower than Ryan, struggling under her weight and their own oxygen deprivation. Ryan ran for 10 minutes, checking the oxygen meter constantly, always moving toward higher readings: 15.5%, 16.0%, 16.8%, 17.5%. The air was getting better. His head was clearing. His lungs were working easier. He was going the right direction. At 1:55 p.m., he rounded a corner and saw something beautiful, their reflective markers from the beginning of the expedition. He recognized Junction Alpha. He was back in the main cave system. And there, clearly marked, was the route to the entrance. Ryan ran faster, following the marked route, the oxygen meter climbing with every passage. 18.2%, 19.0%, 19.8%. At 2:05 p.m. he saw daylight. The entrance. He'd made it. He crawled through the narrow entrance passage and emerged into the November afternoon, gasping fresh 21% oxygen air like a drowning man breaching the surface. He pulled out his radio and called for help. "Emergency. This is Ryan Cooper at Black Hollow Cave. We have 3 people trapped inside with severe hypoxia, 1 unconscious. We need immediate cave rescue and medical." The radio operator responded within seconds, and the emergency response began. But Ryan couldn't wait for rescue. His friends were still trapped in 15 to 16% oxygen, possibly unconscious by now. He took several minutes to breathe deeply, filling his blood with oxygen, then turned around and went back into the cave. The rebreather was depleted, but he had something better now: knowledge of the route. He could guide them out. He ran back through the passages, following the markers in reverse, his headlamp beam bouncing off the walls. It took him 15 minutes to backtrack to where he'd left Michael and James with Lauren. What he found was grim. All 3 of them were sitting on the cave floor, unable to continue. Michael and James had carried Lauren as far as they could, but their oxygen-starved muscles had given out. Lauren was unconscious again. James was barely conscious, slumped against the wall. Michael was the only one still lucid, and barely. "Ryan, did you find it?" Michael's words were slurred, his speech degraded by hypoxia. Ryan knelt beside him. "I found the entrance. I know the way out. But you have to move. All of you. Right now. I'll help, but you have to walk. Getting 3 hypoxic people to move when they could barely think was like trying to herd unconscious cats. Ryan pulled Michael to his feet. "The route is marked. We just follow the reflective tape. 20 minutes and we're out. You can do this." Michael nodded slowly, his movements uncoordinated but determined. He helped Ryan lift Lauren, draping her arm over his shoulder. James struggled to his feet, swaying dangerously. Ryan grabbed him before he could fall. "James, hold on to my backpack. Don't let go." We moved together. They started moving, an awkward shuffling procession through the dark passages. Ryan led, checking the markers constantly, pulling the group forward with sheer willpower. Every 50 feet, they had to stop for Michael and James to catch their breath, their oxygen-deprived bodies struggling with the physical exertion. Lauren was a dead weight between them, occasionally mumbling incoherently but not able to support her own weight. The oxygen meter that Ryan checked obsessively showed they were moving through a gradient: 15.8%, 16.2%, 16.9%. Slowly, agonizingly, they were climbing toward breathable air. At 2:25 p.m., 20 minutes into their extraction attempt, James collapsed. His legs simply gave out, and he went down hard, pulling Ryan backward. I can't do it. Just leave me." Ryan felt a spike of fear. James was giving up, a sign of severe oxygen deprivation affecting his will to survive. People at extreme altitude sometimes experience this, a sudden, overwhelming desire to just lie down and stop fighting. It's the brain's way of conserving energy when it's starving for oxygen. But giving in to that impulse means death. Ryan grabbed James's face, forcing eye contact. "James, look at me. You're a scientist. You know what's happening. Your brain is hypoxic and it's telling you to give up. But we're so close. The entrance is 15 minutes away. Fresh air. Survival. You have kids, James. 2 kids who need their dad. You're going to walk out of this cave. Now get up." The mention of his children seemed to penetrate James's fog. His eyes focused slightly. "Kids. Yeah. Kids." He struggled to his feet with Ryan's help. They continued, but their pace had slowed to a crawl. Michael was barely able to support Lauren anymore. His arms were shaking with exhaustion, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. Ryan ended up bearing most of Lauren's weight, essentially dragging her while trying to keep James upright and moving. His own body was screaming with fatigue, but he had the advantage of having spent those critical minutes at the cave entrance breathing 21% oxygen. His blood oxygen saturation was higher, his brain functioning better, his muscles working more efficiently. That difference was saving all their lives. At 2:40 p.m., 55 minutes after Ryan had first reached the entrance, they emerged from the narrow entrance passage into the afternoon sunlight. All 4 of them collapsed immediately outside the cave, lying on the ground, gulping fresh air. The difference was immediate and profound. Within seconds, their bodies began responding to the normal oxygen levels. Within a minute, color was returning to their faces. Within 2 minutes, consciousness was stabilizing. Michael started crying, not from sadness, but from sheer relief and the emotional crash after hours of sustained terror. But they weren't safe yet. 4.5 hours of oxygen deprivation had done damage to their bodies and brains. Ryan's radio crackled. "Cave rescue team arriving on scene in 5 minutes. Air ambulance ETA 10 minutes. Stay with the victims, assess their condition, provide first aid as needed." Ryan did a quick triage. Lauren was still unconscious despite the fresh air, which was concerning. James was conscious but disoriented, not sure where he was or what had happened. Michael was lucid, but experiencing severe headache, nausea, and muscle tremors. All of them showed signs of altitude sickness, even though they'd been underground. The symptoms of hypoxia are the same whether caused by low air pressure at high altitude or low oxygen content in a cave. The first rescue vehicle arrived at 2:45 p.m. Captain David Martinez and 3 paramedics rushed to the scene with medical equipment. They immediately began assessing the victims. Lauren was placed on high-flow oxygen at 15 liters per minute through a non-rebreather mask, the maximum oxygen delivery short of intubation. Her oxygen saturation, measured with a pulse oximeter, was 78%, dangerously low. Normal is 95 to 100%. At 78%, her organs were being damaged by ongoing oxygen deprivation despite being out of the cave. The paramedics started an IV line and prepared her for immediate air transport. James and Michael also received supplemental oxygen, though at lower flow rates. Their saturation levels were 88% and 91% respectively, low but not immediately life-threatening. Dr. Sarah Kim, the medical consultant who'd arrived with the rescue team, conducted rapid neurological assessments. She checked their pupils, their ability to follow simple commands, their motor coordination. Both showed signs of acute hypoxic injury, slowed responses, impaired short-term memory, difficulty with complex instructions. "How long were you in low oxygen?" she asked Michael. He tried to remember. Maybe 2 hours? 2.5? Below 17%? Michael nodded. "Yeah, down to 15% or so at the worst." Dr. Kim's expression was grim. "That's enough to cause significant brain injury if not treated immediately." The air ambulance landed in a nearby field at 2:52 p.m. Lauren was loaded first, still unconscious, her condition the most critical. The flight medics secured her to a stretcher, maintaining the high-flow oxygen, and the helicopter lifted off immediately for the University of Kentucky Medical Center, the nearest facility with a hyperbaric chamber. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy, breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized chamber, is the treatment for severe hypoxic injury. It floods the body with oxygen, helping damaged tissues recover, potentially preventing permanent brain damage. A second helicopter arrived 10 minutes later for James and Michael. Ryan, whose exposure to low oxygen had been shorter and less severe, would be taken by ground ambulance. Before they loaded Michael into the helicopter, Captain Martinez asked him what had happened in the cave. Michael, still foggy and confused, tried to explain. "The oxygen just kept dropping. We didn't know the cave had bad ventilation. We got lost trying to get out, and the air got worse and worse. We couldn't think straight." Captain Martinez made notes. This would become a case study in cave safety, he knew. A professional scientific team nearly killed by an invisible hazard they'd underestimated. Michael was flown to UK Medical Center, arriving at 3:15 p.m. He was taken directly to the hyperbaric chamber, a large cylindrical pressure vessel that looked like something from a submarine. Inside the chamber, he'd breathe 100% oxygen at 2.5 times normal atmospheric pressure. This hyperoxygenation would force oxygen into his tissues, potentially reversing some of the damage from hours of hypoxia. The treatment would last 2 hours, during which he'd be monitored constantly for any signs of oxygen toxicity, a risk of hyperbaric therapy. James was in a second hyperbaric chamber adjacent to Michael's. Lauren, still unconscious, was in a third chamber with a medical team inside with her, maintaining her airway and monitoring her vitals. The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency. Hypoxic brain injury was a known quantity, a medical emergency they were trained to handle. But the outcome was always uncertain. Some people recovered fully from severe hypoxia. Others suffered permanent brain damage, memory problems, cognitive deficits, personality changes. The next 24 to 48 hours would be critical. Michael emerged from the hyperbaric chamber at 5:30 p.m. feeling better, but exhausted. His headache had diminished. His thinking was clearer. He could remember events more accurately. The treatment had helped, but the doctors warned him that the full extent of any brain damage wouldn't be known for days or weeks. Hypoxic injury can have delayed effects, symptoms that don't appear until days later. He was admitted to the ICU for observation, hooked up to monitors tracking his heart rate, blood oxygen, and brain activity via EEG. James came out of his chamber at the same time with similar results: improvement, but uncertainty. He was also admitted to the ICU. The two of them ended up in adjacent rooms, able to talk through the doorway. "How did we survive that?" James asked, his voice hoarse from hours of panting and low oxygen. Michael didn't have an answer. Luck. Ryan's quick thinking, the fact that we were fit and relatively young. If we'd been older, if we'd panicked more, if Ryan hadn't found the exit when he did. He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew how close they'd come to dying. Lauren's condition was more serious. She remained unconscious through the night despite the hyperbaric treatment. The prolonged hypoxia had caused more severe brain injury, possibly because she'd been the smallest member of the team with the lowest total blood volume, making her more susceptible to oxygen depletion. Or possibly she'd had an underlying condition that made her brain more vulnerable. The neurologists ran tests: CT scan, MRI, EEG. The imaging showed diffuse hypoxic injury, widespread damage to brain tissue from oxygen starvation. The pattern was consistent with severe high-altitude exposure or near drowning. Her prognosis was uncertain. Ryan, who'd had the least oxygen exposure due to his quick exit and return, was treated in the emergency department and released the same evening. Physically, he was fine, but psychologically, he was shattered. He'd led 3 friends into a cave that had nearly killed them. He felt responsible, even though the decision had been collective, the danger unanticipated by everyone. He sat in the hospital waiting room all night, unable to leave while his friends' fates hung in the balance. Lauren woke up on the morning of November 4th, more than 15 hours after collapsing in the cave. Her first words were confused and slurred. "Where am I? What happened?" The nurses explained gently that she'd been in a cave accident, had suffered oxygen deprivation, and was in the hospital. Lauren had no memory of most of the cave exploration. Her last clear memory was taking photographs in Chamber A. Everything after that was gone, erased by hypoxic injury. The neurologists explained that memory loss was common with this type of brain injury, especially for events immediately before and during the trauma. Over the next week, the full extent of the damage became clear. Michael had recovered relatively well. He had persistent headaches and some short-term memory issues, but cognitive testing showed his function was largely intact. He'd been lucky, and the early hyperbaric treatment had likely prevented worse damage. James had similar recovery, though he reported difficulty with complex problem-solving tasks and experienced episodes of confusion that gradually improved over weeks. Lauren's recovery was more complicated. The prolonged unconsciousness had caused more severe injury. She had significant memory problems, difficulty forming new memories, and what neurologists called executive function deficits, problems with planning, organization, and decision-making. She could no longer work as a photographer, at least not at the professional level she'd achieved before. The cognitive demands of managing equipment, composing shots, remembering locations and settings were beyond her damaged brain's capability. She had to move back with her parents, needing assistance with daily activities. She was 30 years old, and her independence had been stolen by a cave that didn't have enough air. The investigation into the Black Hollow Cave incident was thorough and generated significant discussion in the cave exploration community. The Kentucky Speleological Survey conducted an extensive analysis. They re-entered the cave with sophisticated air monitoring equipment and discovered that the deep sections where Michael's team had gotten lost had oxygen levels as low as 14%, even with no one breathing the air. The cave was a natural hypoxic trap. poorly ventilated with numerous dead-end passages where CO2 accumulated and oxygen depleted. The survey's report concluded that Black Hollow Cave should be classified as extremely hazardous and closed to recreational exploration without specialized breathing equipment. But the more important question was, what had the team done wrong? They'd been experienced professional researchers. They'd had an oxygen meter. They'd planned to turn back if oxygen dropped. How had they still nearly died? The analysis identified several critical failures. First, they'd underestimated the cave's poor ventilation. The slight airflow at the entrance had lulled them into thinking the entire system was ventilated. They should have tested oxygen levels deeper in the cave before committing to extensive exploration. Second, they'd brought inadequate breathing redundancy. 2 small emergency rebreathers for 4 people in a potentially hypoxic environment was insufficient. They should have had full supplemental oxygen systems, or turned back the moment oxygen dropped below 20%. Third, and most critically, they hadn't anticipated how hypoxia would impair their navigation and decision-making. Once their oxygen levels dropped below 17%, their brains weren't functioning well enough to efficiently find the exit. They'd gotten lost not because the cave was particularly confusing, but because they were cognitively impaired and making mistakes they'd normally never make. This was the insidious nature of hypoxia. It makes you stupid while simultaneously making you unaware that you're stupid. Paul Hendricks, the cave safety expert who'd investigated several previous incidents, used the Black Hollow Cave case in a widely read article titled "The Invisible Killer: Why Smart Cavers Die in Bad Air." He wrote, "Hypoxia is unique among caving hazards because it attacks your ability to respond to the hazard itself. When you break your leg, your brain still works and you can call for help. When you get lost, your brain still works and you can navigate systematically. But when your brain is oxygen-starved, you lose the very cognitive tools you need to save yourself. You get lost more easily, you make poor decisions, you panic or give up, and you might not even realize anything is wrong until you're unconscious." The article became required reading in cave rescue training programs. Michael, James, Lauren, and Ryan's experience became a case study, taught to new cavers as an example of how even experienced teams can be undone by invisible atmospheric hazards. The key lesson: never trust that a cave has good air until you've verified it at depth. Carry adequate breathing redundancy, and establish hard turnback rules. If oxygen drops below 19%, exit immediately. No exceptions, no "let's just check one more passage." 6 months after the incident, Michael had recovered enough to return to work, though he'd given up cave exploration entirely. The thought of entering a cave triggered anxiety so severe he couldn't function. His career as a cave biologist was over, forcing him to pivot to above-ground ecology. James had similar psychological trauma. He'd tried to return to caving once, with extensive safety equipment including a full scuba-style air tank, but had a panic attack within minutes of entering the cave and had to be escorted out by his companions. Some traumas rewire your brain in ways that can't be undone. Lauren's recovery plateaued after 6 months. The memory and cognitive deficits were permanent. She'd regained most of her independence with coping strategies and assistance, but she'd never returned to her previous level of function. At 31 years old, her promising photography career was over, replaced by disability payments and occupational therapy. She'd lost the most in that cave, and the loss was permanent. Her family filed a lawsuit against the property owner for failing to adequately warn about the cave's dangers. But the case was dismissed. Explorers enter unmarked caves at their own risk. Ryan suffered the least physically, but perhaps the most psychologically. Survivor's guilt consumed him. Why had he recovered when Lauren hadn't? Why had he been the one who found the exit? He replayed the expedition endlessly in his mind, identifying moments where different decisions might have changed the outcome. if they'd turned back when oxygen first dropped below 20%, if they'd brought better equipment, if they'd chosen different passages when lost. The what-ifs were endless and tormenting. He sought therapy for the trauma, and it helped, but the weight of that day would never fully lift. 1 year after the incident, the four of them reunited at Michael's house for a difficult conversation. It was the first time they'd all been together since the hospital. The meeting was awkward and emotionally charged. They needed closure, needed to talk through what had happened and how it had affected them. Lauren, still dealing with memory issues, had to be reminded of parts of the story she couldn't recall. They each shared their perspective, their regrets, their ongoing struggles with the aftermath. At one point, James posed the question they'd all been thinking. Whose fault was it? Michael immediately said, "Mine. I was the team leader. I made the call to explore that cave." But Ryan disagreed. We all agreed to go. We all ignored the warning signs when oxygen started dropping. We all got lost, James added. The cave itself bears responsibility too. It was a natural trap that we couldn't have fully anticipated. Lauren, her speech slower and more deliberate due to her injury, said simply, "It was an accident. Terrible, but an accident." They eventually agreed that there was no single point of failure, no one person to blame. It had been a cascade of small mistakes and unfortunate circumstances. A poorly ventilated cave, inadequate equipment redundancy, cognitive impairment from hypoxia, bad luck in navigation. Any one of those factors alone might have been survivable. All of them together had nearly been fatal. They made a pact that day. They'd share their story publicly, contributing to cave safety education, so that other teams might avoid their mistakes. Michael wrote an article for the National Speleological Society's publication, detailing the entire incident with painful honesty. He included their mistakes, their oversights, the moment-by-moment progression of the crisis. He concluded with this: "We were experienced, educated, professional cave researchers. We had proper equipment. We thought we were being careful, and we still nearly died." This is the danger of complacency, of assuming that experience and equipment are sufficient protection against hazards we don't fully understand. The cave doesn't care about your credentials or your confidence. It only cares about physics. And the physics of bad air is simple. Below 17% oxygen, your brain stops working properly. Below 14%, you lose consciousness. Below 10%, you die. Know these numbers, respect them, and never, ever trust a cave's air until you've verified it. The article was published alongside detailed air quality maps of Black Hollow Cave created during the post-incident investigation. The maps showed oxygen levels throughout the system, clearly illustrating the dead zones where oxygen dropped to dangerous levels. The cave was officially closed by the property owner, the entrance gated and locked, with prominent warning signs about the atmospheric hazards. Black Hollow Cave would claim no more victims. 3 years after the incident, Michael had found a new career teaching ecology at a local community college. He was good at it, and he didn't miss the claustrophobic darkness of caves. James had transitioned to surface geology, studying rock formations from the outside rather than from within. He occasionally looked at cave entrance from a safe distance and felt a ghost of the terror he'd experienced running out of air. Ryan had left the outdoor industry entirely, working now in IT, spending his days in climate-controlled offices that were safe and predictable. Lauren had achieved a remarkable level of adaptation to her cognitive deficits. She'd learned memory strategies, used extensive note-taking and digital reminders, and had even returned to photography in a limited way, focusing on simple nature photography that didn't require the complex planning and execution of professional work. She'd lost much, but she was surviving, even occasionally thriving. Her message to other survivors of traumatic brain injury was one of realistic hope. Recovery was possible, but it meant accepting a new normal, a different version of yourself. 5 years after Black Hollow Cave, the four of them had all found ways to live with what had happened. The physical injuries had healed as much as they ever would. The psychological scars remained but had been integrated into their lives. They no longer had nightmares every night about suffocating in the darkness, though occasional bad dreams still occurred. They'd all developed a hyper-awareness of air quality, noticing stuffy rooms and poor ventilation in ways they never had before. The trauma had changed them permanently, but it hadn't destroyed them. The broader caving community learned from their experience. New safety protocols were established for exploration of unmapped caves, mandatory continuous air monitoring, not just periodic checks, adequate breathing redundancy for all team members, not just emergency backup. Immediate exit if oxygen drops below 19.5%, no exceptions. And most importantly, recognition that cognitive impairment from low oxygen is a real and immediate danger that affects decision-making and navigation. These protocols, written partially in response to Michael's team's near-death experience, have likely prevented multiple deaths in the years since. But protocols and equipment can't eliminate all risk. Caves will always be dangerous. Some caves, like Black Hollow, are natural traps that can kill even careful, experienced people. The only way to avoid that risk entirely is to not enter caves. For professional cave researchers, that's not an option. The scientific value of cave exploration is too great. But for recreational cavers, the question becomes, is the thrill worth the risk? Is the beauty of underground formations worth the possibility of running out of air in the darkness? Your brain slowly dying while you desperately search for an exit you can't find? Michael's answer, hard-won through trauma, was no. Not for him. Not anymore. He'd seen the underground wonders, had experienced the unique adventure of cave exploration, and had paid the price for that experience with brain cells and memories and a piece of his psychological well-being. He was alive, but he was different. The cave had taken something from him that he could never get back. The sense that the world was fundamentally safe, that careful preparation could protect you from harm, that intelligence and experience were shields against danger. He'd learned that sometimes, despite doing everything reasonably right, you can still find yourself suffocating in the darkness with no way out. If you're a caver reading this story, please take it seriously. Test your air continuously, not just occasionally. Carry real breathing redundancy, not token backup. Establish hard turn-back rules and follow them even when it feels overly cautious. Because hypoxia will convince you that you're fine when you're not, that you can go just a little further, that the exit is just around the next corner. It will make you stupid and confident simultaneously, a deadly combination. Michael, James, Lauren, and Ryan survived by luck and Ryan's quick thinking. Many others in similar situations haven't survived. Don't become a statistic. Don't become a case study. Respect the air and exit when it goes bad, even if that means abandoning your exploration. Your brain needs oxygen. Without it, everything else is irrelevant. Black Hollow Cave is still there, still holding its pockets of bad air, still waiting patiently for anyone foolish enough to enter without proper precautions. The cave is neutral, neither hostile nor welcoming. It simply is. But the air inside it can kill you in ways that are invisible and insidious. And that makes it more dangerous than rock falls, floods, or vertical drops because you can see those hazards coming.